Imagine it. The year is 1857. France and England have declared the Second Opium War on China. And remember back in 1841, the year that Harrison was inaugurated, there was a British explorer named James Buchanan, and he was given land to create the kingdom of Sarawak. Well, all these years later, he's still like the ruler of the country. The people are starting to rebel against him. And in Japan, a British seismologist is hired as an advisor. Stateside, the National Association for Baseball Players is created, and the very first elevator is installed in New York City. And the very first president from Pennsylvania, as well as the only lifelong bachelor, is inaugurated. James Buchanan enters into his presidency inheriting the crisis of 1857. Essentially, it's a financial depression, and we've talked about this before, but often people blame the current sitting president for this problem. He comes in as it's happening, so it's not his fault. But he doesn't really do a whole lot to help the situation as much as you would think. So the first thing he does is essentially modifies a tariff that had already been in place before he became president. This tariff really just benefits the South. So the North is the one that gets the brunt force of the depression here. The ramifications of this depression would go on for 2 years. So the North is not particularly happy and won't be with him for a while. And he also comes into his presidency at a very awkward time based upon the issues going on with slavery. You see, this, as you know, if you've been watching, this has been an ongoing hot button debate topic. And each president seems to want to pass the buck as far as like laying down the law in regards to it. Everyone has their own feelings about it. Everyone, especially like Pierce, he was trying to cater to both sides. And it just doesn't get any better. You think about, this is the last president before Civil War erupts. In his inaugural address, he basically fluffs off slavery as a problem. He expects that slavery is going to be decided one way or another by the Supreme Court during the Dred Scott decision. But that's not exactly what ends up happening. The Dred Scott decision, which could be a whole video on its own, essentially says that the African Americans, the black population, aren't citizens, and they can't decide as the Supreme Court on property, and as they are clearly viewed as, blacks are viewed as property as far as this Dred Scott decision goes. And slavery was to be allowed on territory. See, we talked about how there's been such an issue with statehood versus territory, and it's a lot of it's because territories weren't allowed to have slaves, just by the fact that they were not a state and they didn't have a constitution that said one way or the other. The Dred Scott decision says slavery is up for grabs. That also negates the Missouri Compromise. So a lot of things are thrown into chaos with the Dred Scott decision. Elsewhere in the country, 140 people are murdered on their way to California because of a radical Mormon who recruits other Mormons and some Native Americans to basically attack these people, all because he was mad that Buchanan decided to take the Mormon governor, and replace him. And speaking of other interesting Buchanan decisions, he decided to use his power as president to push Kansas into statehood so that it could be a slave state. This would start the beginning of a long line of chaos, trying to figure out if Kansas was a state or a territory, and if it was slave or free. This could be a whole video in itself. and Minnesota and Oregon were admitted into the Union as free states. At the same time, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, Southern leaders were coming together and trying to reestablish the African trade market, which had been out since like 1808. In the fall of 1859, a man named John Brown gathered 20 people to go and essentially raid an armory and gain all these weapons in an attempt to go through the South and just start freeing slaves, and to gather a whole group of people eventually and make a whole movement out of it, among other things. He was captured and hung. But there were notable people who defended his actions based on what he was trying to accomplish. One of those people being Abraham Lincoln. The country is so divided at this point that nothing is happening in the government even. And every bill that's passed by a majority House of Representatives by the Republicans is stopped in the Senate by a majority of the Democrats. And nothing is happening. And so this is going to lead to the first big divide we see between the North and the South, when the Democrat Party actually breaks up in itself. And you have the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. And so what ends up happening is, when it comes time for the next election, or when they start picking candidates to move forward, they have a problem, because Democrats are now nominated 2 different people to run against the Republican nominee, Abraham Lincoln. So, to avoid living for the next 4 years, at least, under a Republican candidate who is most likely going to do something against slavery, the South has had enough. Despite having been catered to by this guy, they decide that they're done and they're ready to secede. To be fair, they did ask Buchanan if they could go before they left on their own, and he said no, because he believed there was a compromise somewhere. But there wasn't, and they didn't want to compromise anymore anyway. So South Carolina was the first to secede from the Union, and by the time his job is over, there are 7 states that have seceded, and the Confederacy has been formed. By January of '61, Buchanan finally decided that he was going to do something about it, and replaced the cabinet members who had resigned with Northerners, and was willing to send, and did send, military reinforcements to Fort Sumter, something we'll hear more about in the next video. But at this point, it was too late. War was imminent, and that was the last official thing that Buchanan did. He went on autopilot for the rest of his presidency, which fortunately wasn't too long. Next, all hell breaks loose.